Hello, everyone. Welcome to this evening's Planning Commission meeting. This is a regularly scheduled meeting. It is Thursday, May 2nd, 2019. Who wants to give the Pledge of Allegiance? I don't have very many options tonight, Mr. Jake Stevens. Sorry, Diana, get your wish.
Please rise, put your hand over your heart. Ready, begin. I pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you for gamely doing that. Item 3 is roll call. Secretary Gillig, could you please do roll for us?
Good evening. Commissioner Hoopengarner,
Present.
Commissioner Harrickson,
here.
Commissioner Buckner,
Present.
Commissioner Elchel, here. Commissioner Bass,
Here.
Vice Chair Carvalero,
Here.
Chair Jones,
Here.
and we have a quorum.
Thank you. Item 4 is approval of the agenda. This is for approval of tonight's agenda. Do I have a motion to move as is, or any recommendations for changes? No.
We have a motion by Commissioner Erickson, seconded by Commissioner Bass. And the agenda is approved.
Thank you. Item 5 is approval of the minutes from our April 18th, 2019 meeting.
We have Commissioner Erickson moved, seconded by Chair Jones. And the minutes for April 18th, 2019 are approved.
Thank you. Item 6 is public comment. David, do we have any public speakers?
We have no public speakers.
Great, thank you. Well, I mean, not great, but, we always welcome public comment here at the Planning Commission, but thank you. You're great. Item 7 is the director's report.
Thank you, Chair and Commissioners. John Kehoe, Director for Planning and Development Services. Just provide a brief update on the items that are on Monday's City Council agenda that are of interest for the Planning Commission. So the first public hearing on Monday's agenda is the appeal of the Planning Commission's approval of a new 4-story, 14-unit condo building at 1257 Sweetser Avenue. So that's an appeal on that one. They're appealing the historic aspects of the project, and so that's going to the council on Monday. There's also the second public hearing is changes to the sunset-specific plan that the Planning Commission reviewed, and that was to change the rear setback requirement from 5 to 10 feet. So that's on the agenda. And then another item that should be of interest to the Planning Commission, and that's a council discussion on Senate Bill 50. Some of you may have been hearing in the news about Senate Bill 50, so the council has an item. It's item 4D on their agenda, unfinished business. So the council will be talking about the impact of that bill on West Hollywood, and we'll talk about whether or not they want to support it or not. So we intend to bring that report to the Planning Commission after the City Council's talked about it on Monday, so we can provide that information to you, since if it is passed, it will have impact on planning in West Hollywood. So that's my updates for tonight.
Thank you. Any questions for Director Kehoe? No? All right, thank you very much. Item 8 is items from commissioners.
Yes, ma'am.
Go ahead, Ms. Sue Buckner.
Well, a little birdie told me that it was somebody's birthday today. So I want to wish our chair a very, very happy birthday. And I hope you're going to have some fun later after this meeting and the rest of the week, because I think you should celebrate for a whole week. Birthdays.
Thank you. Thank you. I want everyone to know that tonight's fun or not fun has no bearing on the duration of tonight's meeting. So. Are
you sure?
I am. I'm very, very sure, actually. Commissioner Erickson, sorry.
Commissioner Buckner stole my thunder, so in wishing Chair Jones a happy birthday, but I'll say it again. You're great, so happy birthday. I just wanted to bring to the public's attention the West Hollywood Women's Leadership Conference next week, Saturday, May 11th. You can get flyers in the lobby or find out online if you go to WehoWLC.org. It's actually my favorite event that the City of West Hollywood does, and I well, I did them all, but this is my favorite event. It really empowers women, men, people from all walks of life in your community to create local change and really get involved. And so definitely take advantage. Commissioners get in for free, and I hope staff can go too. And I hope that people will go. It really is probably one of the best leadership conferences in Southern California put on by our very own city, and it's a really great time to go meet like-minded people.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I echo the happy birthday.
Thank you. Thank you very much. All right. Well, with that, I will move on. I don't have any comments about my age, so only to thank you all for being such wonderful colleagues. Item 9 is consent calendar. There is none. And with that, we will move into public hearings. Item 10, and our first public hearing is item A, 1250 North Fuller Avenue. Again, this is a request to subdivide a 3-unit residential building into a common interest development. And I will lob this over to staff. Derek, Jennifer, hello.
Thank you. Good evening. Derek Purification, Associate Planner, City of West Hollywood. The item before you tonight is for the subdivision of a recently approved 2-story, 3-unit multifamily building over semi-subterranean parking into a multiple condominium ownerships. The site is located at 1250 Fuller Avenue. It's in the R2 zone, which is residential low density. The lot is located just south of Fountain between Martel and Poinsettia Place. Here on the next slide, you can see that the approved building is proposed to be subdivided into 3 separate units in townhouse style, where the parking is at the bottom and the units go above. And as I mentioned previously, the development was recently approved. It was done administratively on October 25th of 2018. Tonight's request is just for the review of the subdivision only, though. The proposed subdivision is categorically exempt from CEQA provisions pursuant to Section 15332 as an infill development project. And in closing, staff is able to make the findings to recommend approval pursuant to the conditions in the attached draft resolution PC-19-1321. That concludes my presentation. I'm available for any questions, and I believe the applicant is here as well. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Derek. Any questions for staff at this time? No? Disclosures, any disclosures to report at this time? No? The applicant does have 10 minutes to present if the applicant wishes to. It's also totally fine if you don't want to. Is the applicant? Okay, thank you. I just want to make sure you know that that's something that is available to you. Any questions for the applicant? Okay. Do we have any public speakers on this item, David?
We have no public speakers.
Okay. I'm assuming since you didn't want to do a presentation and there weren't any public comments that you won't need to rebut this. Okay. All right. Well, with that, I will close public testimony, and we can move into deliberation, if there is deliberation, which it looks like there is not.
Yes, I made a motion, and just for the public's awareness, this particular project comes to the commission simply to approve the condominium plan. The project itself has already been approved at staff level with the director's hearing, I believe, or staff hearing. I don't know exactly how it happened, but it was approved at staff level. And I move that we pass this on and affirm the staff report.
Thank you very much. All right. So we have a motion, and Commissioner Buckner, to be clear, is your motion to move staff's recommendation?
Yes, to remove staff recommendation.
Who hasn't voted?
And the motion passes unanimously.
Thank you. Moving on to item 10B, ZTA for green building requirements. It looks like we have Robin and Bianca. Lovely to see you as always.
Good evening, Commissioners. For the record, my name is Robin Eason, Senior Sustainability Planner with the Long Range Planning Division. I'm joined here tonight by Walker Wells from Ramey and Associates. He's been our lead consultant on this project. I'll give a short presentation before questions. So the item before you tonight is a proposed amendment to update the city's green building requirements. This item was directed to staff by City Council with the objective to maintain a best-in-class green building program and build upon the leadership and success of the 2007 ordinance. So we began the process by asking some key questions. What are the city's current green building priorities? Are they different or the same from 2007? Do we pursue a new iteration of the local point-based system? Has that been working? What should we change? Do we simply defer to lead, like other cities have done, past and present? Do we align with and build upon the state's requirements now that they've been released for almost 10 years? And do we still offer incentives for high-achieving projects? And so to answer those questions, we held several meetings with 2 stakeholder groups, a multi-departmental city working group and a community stakeholder working group. And we were able to get some insightful feedback on several major themes that you see at the bottom of your screen. Responsiveness to local characteristics, water management, and tree canopy and green space rose to the top as priorities for the city. Some of these concerns have been addressed in this effort, while others like residential parkways, tree preservation, and establishment of future tree canopy is and will be addressed via separate city initiatives. We also discussed the best possible framework for an updated program, recognizing that the point-based system was appropriate for the 2007 program, but less so in 2019, and that leveraging the state's existing requirements as our new baseline and building upon these local requirements, or building upon these at the local level, was the best way to continue to exhibit leadership in this space. So I'm just going to walk you through this slide because I think it'll be really helpful to explain our approach. So essentially what we did was we reviewed the state code and we structured our amendment to mimic the structure of the state code. So where the state details measures in site planning and design, energy efficiency, water efficiency, we've organized our amendments to do the same by those categories. Next, we struck out language in our code that was duplicative to reduce confusion. And then we kept green building measures in our code that were already locally specific. So things like permeable surfaces, stormwater diversion, transportation demand management, alternative transportations, all those things stayed the same. And then there were a few things that were already more stringent than the state code, like construction waste management, that we kept as is as well. And then from there, we introduced new local green building requirements. So the diagram at the bottom visually depicts the results of this approach. A code-compliant building at the state level produces a base-level green building. A code-compliant building in West Hollywood would produce a greener building by integrating both state and local green building requirements. And then a local project seeking special approvals would be required to achieve even higher thresholds in addition to state and local green building mandates. This next slide just shows our recommendations at a glance and depicts how we organize the local requirements using the state's current green building categorization. So just to reiterate, site planning and design through environmental quality are categories of the state. And so we try to, again, organize our recommendations to mimic that to facilitate the applicant experience. Additional slides are available if the commission desires to see new and existing requirements for each category in more detail. Just as significant was the need to streamline the implementation and administration process and foster transparency and a roadmap for compliance throughout the planning review, plan check, and inspection processes. Provided in your packet were drafts of sample verification forms that outline steps for compliance for applicants at each phase, and the required checklists with integrated state and local green building requirements. Lastly, regarding incentives, there was debate within the working group and the long-range subcommittee as to whether we should continue to incentivize all other projects not seeking special approvals to achieve very high thresholds in green building. The recommendation on the floor requires only high-achieving measures for projects seeking special approval, so that's development agreements and specific plans. But we have included an alternative recommendation in the staff report, should Planning Commission prefer the option with incentives and voluntary high-achieving measures for all projects. The formal language for this option was shared with Planning Commission earlier today. I apologize for any confusion that may have caused. This alternative recommendation only reflects modifications in Section 2 of the proposed zone text amendment. This concludes my presentation. I'd be happy to take questions.
Thank you, Robin. Do we have any questions for staff at this time?
Yes, I do.
Go ahead, sir.
So the competition with other incentives, how are you accounting for them? Because we don't want to double up with the incentives and come up with something that the city doesn't want. So what are the incentives especially, and how do you double check so that we're not double giving a developer more than I would say that is preferred by the city?
Sure. So the incentives essentially are parking reductions.
And sorry, Robin, and I'm talking about mostly with regard to the extra incentives for the alternative plan. That's what I'm concerned with.
Okay, so this debate actually came up when we were figuring out whether we wanted to include incentives in the first place. And we really struggled with the multiple incentive issue. And that was one of the things that, we just kind of really struggled with in terms of whether there would be value in some of the incentives based on that there's other incentives out there that are competing with the requirements. But just to be clear about what those incentives are, just to level set all of us, if you look at the bottom of this slide, basically we're proposing parking reductions of a certain percentage for non-residential projects and multifamily projects of a certain amount of units, commercial projects and mixed-use projects on commercially zoned lots that may attain an additional FAR, 0.1, and then multifamily residential projects of 3 or more units may receive an additional unit. And so, those would be considered if someone were to achieve those high thresholds with green building.
And these are the same incentives that would go to development parties under development agreement?
No, the development agreement projects.
These are required.
These would be required, yeah, they would need to be required to achieve one of the high achieving measures, but they would not be entitled to any incentives.
Well, what do they get for a high achieving measure? Is there an incentive or a benefit?
Well, the idea is that if they're engaging in a specific plan or a development agreement, they're coming with something that they want already. And so our idea is that in order to negotiate and get what the city, a benefit of the city out of that, they would have to select one of those high achieving measures in order for us to consider what they would want out of their project.
Could they have more than one?
No.
Okay, thank you. Did you want to say something, Bianca?
I was just going to clarify your last question. Could they have more than one? Just to be clear, there's no incentive being offered to development agreement or specific plan projects, right? It's just a baseline requirement that they have to comply with a high achieving measure. That's what's proposed. The incentives would, if the commission wanted to make that recommendation, the incentives would apply to all other project types as an option. Yeah.
But with development agreements would not necessarily get two?
By nature, a development agreement is typically done when someone is asking for something that's outside of what's allowed under the zoning ordinance, and so the assumption is that embedded in the project proposal is something more, and so there's not really an incentive that needs to be applied to that. It's just the project And then we, as,
And it's a benefit to the city.
exactly.
Thank you.
Any additional questions for staff?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Commissioner Pingarner.
I'm going to start out with our esteemed legal counsel. The alternates that were delivered this morning, last night, this morning, how are we noticing issues here? Because, I mean, I know a number of people who were on our committee who were reading this, and I'm sure they're not aware of this alternate. So how does that work with noticing?
Okay, so let me start that answer, and then we'll have the city attorney jump in if we need to. The language that was provided to you this morning is the specific code language that would that we would recommend if the commission wanted to add back in the incentive program. The policy proposal with the incentives included is what was reviewed by the long-range subcommittee and, excuse me, and is what was discussed previously with both working groups. It was actually as a result of input from the long-range subcommittee and further examination of the relative benefits of offering those incentives that staff was proposing removing the incentive program. But the staff report that was distributed in the packet, in the report itself, as well as in attachment D, I believe, outlined in great detail what the incentive program would be. So the attachment that we sent out this morning is just the specific code language so that it's available should we need to read it into the record tonight, if that's the option that the commission wants to go with.
So where's that in the staff report?
On page 8 of 9, there's a provision that says alternative recommendation at the very top. That's what Bianca was referring to. And then it refers to an Exhibit D, which has more information about incentivizing projects. So the information is in here. This is just how it could be written into the code if the commission wants to make it part of the recommendation. The base recommendation does not include incentives. And you can function on either tonight.
Okay. It just was a little confusing, and the user might have missed Exhibit D because they were focusing on the main recommendation. Okay. So let's see. I have some very specific questions and some more big questions. Robin, in your Exhibit C, you reference that, and you have the grid about what's going and what's staying and all of that. In here it says replace existing trees over 6 inches in diameter, and that's required by the city. And then on the next page, unfortunately these aren't really numbered, I guess it's number 2, that the reason that the green building current requirement for putting in canopy trees was being removed is because it's already in our code that you say replacement of existing mature trees is required. Are you proposing that in a future amendment to 19.26.40 that last item, number 7, would be removed? Because this has never been enforced, this preserving of 6-inch trees. We've approved dozens and dozens and dozens of things in the past 2 years alone that have ripped out many trees. And that item 7 says, director determines the removal of tree is necessary to carry out construction in compliance with approved plans. So that's pretty toothless in our existing code. Are you planning on removing that section, or?
We're not planning on removing that section at this time. What we're doing is we're going to evaluate tree canopy as a whole within the city. Facilities have already started to do this from a data perspective. In the Climate Action Plan update, we'll look at tree canopy as a whole and then make some recommendations on what we should do to the various parts of our code that deal with trees.
Because I think it's not quite accurate to be on our little grid here to be saying, oh, well, we require the replacement of trees when in fact we don't.
Fair.
I mean, if that code says sure, cut them all down, then there's really nothing here to say no, replant.
Sure, that's fair.
Okay. And needless to say, I would vote for replanting. Okay. In table 3.7, which I'm going to lose my place. You had the language, I think we discussed this at both the committee meetings and in long range, that this vegetative space that was being created in exchange for a parking space would be on grade. And I'm concerned that I'm wondering why the language about above an underground structure was used instead of on grade. Because there's other impediments that could be under the grade, which would defeat the purpose of this incentive. So I was curious as to why this language was chosen.
This isn't necessarily, this is Walker Wells, the consultant to the city. A concern I might have is that grade can sometimes be a moving target, so I might read that and say, is this the existing grade or the grade of the finished project? So, I mean, the intent is that it's in soil and not above structure. So if this seems like somebody could still figure out how to plant a tree that isn't in dirt, that goes all the way down to the center of the earth, we welcome a suggestion. But
I would just be concerned that the intent of this language was very clear, that it be about the ability for that additional 160 square feet to perk to the aquifer.
Yes.
In addition, sustain a full canopy tree.
Mm-hmm.
So any impediment underground would be a problem, and I'm worried that limiting that to the underground structure.
Yeah, I think we're in agreement there. I just think this grade topic can be
I'm
a
all
bit of a
down with
moving.
any other language. but
Yeah.
I just am concerned.
Okay, I don't know if there's a.
And related to that, at the end of that, it talks about the vegetative area may include space that is part of any required setback. I seem to remember that we talked about it being in addition to the existing setbacks, that the point was that it was additional green space. Am I?
Yeah, I guess we went kind of back and forth about that. I think ultimately we concluded that having it within or including the setback area was okay, because we're talking about the soft spaces, but
I mean, some of the other conversation was, perhaps the best place to have this vegetated area would be along the side of the building, and then you would want people to be able to have the side yard setback count towards this area and not just assume it would be in the front or the back. So this was some of the discussion, and I think this may have been why we decided that allowing this space to include required setbacks would be the preferred way to go.
Okay. So on both of the mandated development agreement requirements, and the new alternates, you give the option of going for LEED Gold or Platinum, et cetera. And you put in there that it had to be done within 24 months. But I believe we discussed it briefly. Was there any intention of having consequences to not achieving this? Because at the end of 24 months, they don't achieve it. They've got their building, they're done. Are we going to have a performance bond requirement that they would sacrifice if they don't achieve the LEED Platinum by 24 months? Is there something that we're incorporating in some other area of the code that would address that?
It would,
So, yes, an approach similar, either a performance bond or a similar measure would be included in the development agreement as a requirement. So development agreements, right, include penalties for noncompliance of various kinds, and should a project, not be able to comply with that provision, we would be able to negotiate.
And the bond would remain in place for the 2-year period subsequent to the C of O?
And I'm sorry?
The bond would remain in place for the 2-year period subsequent to the C of O?
Potentially, yeah, we'd have to look at.
I mean, it would have to in order to
Yeah.
enforce it.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, they could get it done more quickly and release the bond, but,
Sure.
yeah, but I think if they, I mean, the idea is if you, I mean, this is as a practitioner, if you can't get your lead documentation together and submit it and get through certification in 24 months, it's probably like
gonna
not a
happen.
priority. It's not going to happen, and, that's enough time, a reasonable amount of time for somebody who has the intention of actually following through to actually complete it.
Okay. But Bianca, you mentioned that it would be part of the development agreement, but if we included the new alternatives, then there is no development agreement, so it would have to go into the resolution? In which case, does it need to be in the ordinance that would be a requirement?
If I may, that particular provision stood out to me too, because I was wondering how that was going to be reinforced. I do think there needs to be more specific language of the consequences if they don't comply, so that developers know upfront what's going to happen. Thank you for bringing it up.
I mean, my thinking is that the sort of consequences is something that gets, I mean, I feel like it could be referenced in the code, but then specifically what they are would be something that could be determined by staff. I don't know currently about the ability to get these performance bonds, but when I've been through this before, people would say, nice idea, Walker, but who would actually issue this performance bond specifically related to LEED? I think in Bianca's example, it's for all of the conditions for a development agreement. So I agree, though, that there needs to be some recourse for the city. If you're giving away a public benefit, something that is held publicly, the ability to develop, you need some assurance that you would get the reciprocal public benefit, whatever of these 3 options are.
Why not require the certification before they get their final occupancy permit?
It's sometimes not tenable.
Huh?
You can't, sometimes the requirements can't even be measured until after it's occupied.
Oh, okay.
The results
Right.
of the thing that you're doing has to be, the metric has to be achieved by occupying the building. So,
Right. So maybe I can clarify. There's already language in the zoning code that allows us to condition projects. And so, excuse me, I apologize for my voice tonight. So the performance bond would be included as a condition in the development permit.
again, I'm just concerned, should we go with the alternate where there's no DA, then it would have to go into the resolution, and I'm concerned that that could be missed if it's not part of the code. So, we aren't there yet. I just, okay. I think one of the things I recall us discussing is a reference to the calculation on the square footage when referencing these projects, and that the square footage would be calculated in the same manner as they are under 69, I always forget the number, the affordable housing, and the same calculation that we use for our in lieu fee. And I didn't see that here. Is that going to be someplace else? In particular, when calculating square footage for affordable housing, You have to use all of the open space, the balconies, the roof decks, all of that counts towards the square footage total. And the same is true on the in lieu fee. So we discussed that that would be the same calculation that would be used when referring to the square footage measurements in the green building code. And so my question is, where is that referenced as to how that calculation is done in relation to the green building code?
I'm not sure if I'm clear that we have
So
discussed that.
For example, the mandatory roof requirement,
Sustainable roof requirements.
sustainable roof requirement is referring to a gross floor area of 10,000 square feet or more.
So
So the conversation that we had was that that 10,000 square feet would be calculated using the same calculations that the state requires for 69, whatever it is, and that we use also for our in lieu fee calculation.
So there's a definition for gross floor area in the zoning ordinance that applies, that is how we calculate gross floor area. So that would be the same in this case.
That would be the same in this, okay. And that includes the outdoor areas, the balconies, the roof decks.
We're reading. No, decks are excluded, unenclosed and outdoor spaces are excluded from the definition of gross floor area.
So it's not the same metric that is used for in lieu or for affordable housing?
I'd have to check. I'm not familiar with that specific requirement.
Okay. And that roof requirement, is there a reason for the January 2020 date instead of the normal, the way we do code, which is 30 days after the code goes into, is approved by council?
Yes, because that's an energy requirement, we have to get approval from the Energy Commission to actually have that as a mandatory requirement. And so that takes a few months after it's adopted by council in order to get. And it's easier because the entire code changes at the end of the year to just make that a January 1st, 2020 date.
Okay, thank you. If a project comes to us and is zero net energy, LEED platinum, et cetera, are we envisioning any provisions to say, yay, you way exceed our minimum requirements, and you don't have to do a sustainable roof because you've done all of these other things way above and beyond a minimum? Or is that project going to be required to do a sustainable roof on top of everything else? I'm concerned about the question of, giving an architect the ability to do some really great things, but then be burdened by an additional requirement that doesn't fit into the schema of what they're doing in other respects.
Sure. Yeah, that's fair. I think what we tried to do here was raise the minimum requirements for green building. So if someone comes with a spectacular project, we won't prevent them from doing that in order to meet the requirements. In fact, if they're coming with that kind of project, they probably already meet our requirements. So I don't think that'll be an issue. And, we can make sure staff is aware of that flexibility that needs to happen if that scenario comes.
Because this is mandatory, so that would be, I'm all down with mandatory green, but I worry about inflexibility.
Sure. Now, I mean, the thing that we wanted to do throughout this code and these revisions is to be more flexible for people to do the right thing, especially the outstanding thing.
Okay. I think those are my questions. I know we have public comment.
Do we have any other questions for staff at this time? Okay. I will move into public comment then, since we don't have any disclosures. Any public speakers, David?
We do. We have one. Emily Gable.
All right. Emily Gable, thank you for coming. Please, when you come to the podium, state your name and city of residence. You'll have 3 minutes to speak.
Good evening, Commissioners. My name is Emily Gable. I'm a resident of West Hollywood. And I sat on the resident or public working group that staff put together for this project. It was a great experience. So mainly I want to commend staff for all the wonderful work they did, as well as the work that the other residents, business owners, architects that sat on the working group did as well, including our commissioner here. The one thing that I'd like to speak about, I guess, is something that was just brought up by Commissioner Hubengardner about the vegetated area with a tree in lieu of the parking space. My recollection is that the working group thought that that being in the required setback was okay, my recollection. But I do want to echo the concern that the language of that statement be very clear about it being connected with the earth so that water infiltrates, and maybe putting, including a statement about the intent in with that code language would mean that whoever is having to interpret that section knows why it's there and what we're really trying to get at. That's all my comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for coming. Any other public comment, David?
No more public speakers.
Okay, great, thank you. So with that, I will close the public testimony portion of the hearing, and we can move into deliberation. Who would like to go first? Commissioner Buckner? You're giving me a look.
Oh, I'm just going to ask our legal counsel, do some of the suggestions that were made here tonight, do they need to be added in order to move it forward to council, or will council have either a summary or something of what commissioners have talked about?
I think that we can, it depends how in-depth your recommendation is going to be and what kind of changes you want. A few little language changes I think that we can incorporate after the fact, and we'll need to know such bigger questions as whether or not you want to do the incentives or not. Those types of language we'll want to know tonight, but little changes I think that we can incorporate, and I can also help you come up with some language.
Well, I mean, I must say this was not easy to go through, and it was hard for me to figure out what was old and new and how it related. So I did have an opportunity to talk to staff this afternoon, which did help me read it in a clearer way. But I think it's, I mean, we have to do it. We have to modify our code or amend our code so that it complies with state requirements, at least meets that. I understand the city wanting to go beyond because we've always made an effort to be a leader in this area in particular. So I'm in favor of moving to the alternative forward, or making the recommendation that we have the alternative, because I think it gives an option to developers that say of smaller projects or not on Sunset Strip or someplace where they would be doing a development deal, an opportunity to get an incentive perhaps that would make their project even more attractive and more beneficial, and we get another benefit as far as the green program goes. So that would be my inclination.
Thank you. Commissioner Hubengardner. Commissioner Erickson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to agree with Commissioner Buckner in regards to moving the alternatives forward. When I was looking through this a while ago in regards to thinking about all the ways in which we can encourage projects to go above and beyond a lot of the mandatory provisions, I am in strong favor of taking that next step to make sure West Hollywood leads the way on green building requirements. We have always been that city. Although at many of our meetings, we have a robust conversation about the green points. So I think that tells you about how nitty gritty we actually get into the actual details. I appreciate the city looking at all of our code, looking at what the state offers, looking at what we offer, either combining the two or going above and beyond. And I think these alternatives do that. And also I think it is fair to incentivize the ways in which we can do that around the city. And as my fellow commissioner said, not just in specific areas. I am in favor additionally of moving these, moving the alternative as well. And I think that many cities aren't thinking in the ways in which we are right now. I think a lot of cities are very still stuck in the 90s or maybe the 80s if you're Beverly Hills. Sorry, well, I was looking at housing numbers earlier. But I think that the city of West Hollywood needs to lead the way in how we look at green building reform moving forward and what that looks like in 2020 and beyond, and set the standard. And I think these alternatives are a great way to get there. So I'm in favor of the alternative, and that's all I have to say.
Commissioner Hoopengarner?
So I really want to thank Robin and Walker and the team. This is a lot to wrestle. We had how many meetings? We had a lot of meetings. And we went through a lot of content, and a lot of areas were discussed. The great news is, back in 2007, we were world class. We were leading the world. But the good news is the state has caught up, and we have state code now that makes our stuff redundant, a large chunk of it. And throughout our meetings, it became abundantly clear that there's very little we can do to further increase energy savings at this point, beyond what the state has already mandated. However, at this time in our history when, polar bears are wandering into people's living rooms because they can't find food, I wonder, are we being as progressive as we could have been? And are we really pushing the envelope the way we did a decade ago? And I realize, Robin, that some of this stuff is getting pushed off to the tree committee and climate action and all of that. But I'm concerned that what we've done here is nominal, and that we could be doing more aggressive things that are still very feasible for developers, and that focus on the things that we continued to talk about in our meetings. And those were two major themes. And one was dealing with the heat island effect, which immediately relates to tree canopy and green space, and to dealing with water, something that the state does not do as much with. Now, we've put a number of things in the code. We've got more efficient toilets and more efficient faucets and things like that. But we're not really addressing the big water, the storm water, the water runoff. We do have the gray water systems in here, but we haven't really addressed cisterns and a lot of other things that there were pros and cons that we talked about. But in particular, the item of green space and tree canopies addresses actually both water and heat island effect. And every tree that you take down and put a parking lot underneath, to semi-quote Joni Mitchell, you are taking away a tremendous amount of the stormwater runoff that the tree captures And you're destroying the ability to perk down to the aquifer. And every time that we sit here and approve a lot line to lot line building, we've destroyed not only the trees, but the ability to perk water back into our aquifer. And our little parking space that we did, the 160 square feet, that's our little nod to, yes, we want more green space. But I think we could do a lot more nodding to more green space. And it wouldn't be necessarily onerous. In particular, we could do something like, say, 5 feet of the backyard setback, of the rear setback, could be required to be at grade. And that would then give the ability and the possibility of adding a requirement that actual canopy trees be replaced. To my comment about the code saying, you know, for every 6-inch tree you cut out, you're supposed to replace another tree, but we don't actually do that because the code says, oh, by the way, if you have to tear everything out to build something, knock yourself out. We aren't actually doing anything to replace that tree canopy, and that is fundamental to heat island effect. If this, what I forget which year they're now saying that we're going to be 2 degrees warmer and what the consequences are, but the year keeps getting closer to today. It's not going in the other direction. And we're not doing our part to help that by allowing every single tree in this city to be cut down on every single property. I understand the need, you know, people want to develop, et cetera. We need housing, we got to find that balance. But I think we can find that balance in a way that still gives us some ability to create more green. And such as cutting into the setback, you can't do garage lot line to lot line, have enough space to have additional perk and additional trees. And that would be an opportunity to do something that is back to what we were doing in 2007 and really sort of set a best practice about that. Related to that, in our current code, we have a lot of redundant stuff. Wrap your pipes and all of that, that's all in the state code. But we do have some good things in our code that are now going away by not having the same checklist, like narrow floor plates, like shading devices. There's also some opportunities to add things like thermal chimneys and high-performance facades and thermal mass that would create a high-performing building which would require less energy. And I'm worried that we're not doing those things. We're not sort of guiding developers and architects to use those tools that are available to them to achieve what we want to achieve, which is high-performing, energy-efficient buildings, and not just using Energy Star, you know, appliances, but actually reduce the demand instead of just saying, oh, we're being more efficient with what we're putting in. And I think we have some real opportunities here that wouldn't be onerous, but we haven't incorporated. And I think that's basically my last of my comments, with the exception of I am not in favor of the alternative, and I agree with staff recommending it as an alternative and not as their primary recommendation, in part because I think the incentives far exceed the benefit that we would be getting. The benefit that we would be getting for a 50% improvement over Title 24 is not, in my opinion, worth a $500,000 new unit. And, you know, an entire new residential unit. And we also don't have quite understanding how that would fit in with affordable housing and the requirements of the calculations, which is another question, which I'm sure legal can address. But I don't find good alignment between the high-achieving requirements and the incentives. I think we talked about this at long range, and it's why it's alternative and not the primary recommendation. So at this point, I would be willing to move forward with staff's recommendation, not the alternative, and with maybe perhaps some of the adjustments that we discussed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Could I ask, my fellow commissioner a question. You know more about this than I do, and I appreciate, thank you for sharing that. The suggestions that you made with I guess the skin of the building being a certain thing, why couldn't they be additional things that could be in here as an incentive in order to achieve a higher green, achieving, building?
There's two approaches to this. One is we could simply mandate things. We could simply say, you will have thermal chimneys in your building. That's an option that we have. Now, that can be difficult depending upon the size of the building. And so you can't make it a categorical, if you're doing a little four condo unit, you could do thermal chimneys in a way that's practical. But if you're doing a giant mega mixed-use project, it's not as practical.
Well, I was suggesting it not as a mandated thing or mandatory, but as an additional thing that they could get to achieve a higher level of compliance, let's say, to the green.
So the conversations that we had, somewhat ad nauseum, were about the incentives. That what do we want? We want things that have thermal chimneys so they don't have to use the air conditioning. That's a high performance building. They've got good thermal chimneys, they've got shading devices, they've got lots of ventilation, therefore you don't need your air conditioning all the time. That is the best way to save energy, is to not use it at all, okay? So we want to incentivize that. Yes, great. What are we willing to give in exchange for that, okay? And so I would suggest that maybe I would be willing to say, yes, you can have another whole unit, but I would say, I want a thermal chimney and add more for that benefit, so that there's a better parity for what we're giving up and what we're getting.
Did it, because you were on the subcommittee, so did it sort of fall aside because it was too complicated? Or the benefits
we ran out of
didn't
time.
outweigh?
we had a lot of conversations that went way past our allotted hours. We had 3-hour meetings that went to 4 hours, I think. Sorry. So
I don't want to send you back there.
But we had some excellent conversations about all of this. And one of the conversations we had about incentives was about the speed of the permitting process, that could have a real value to a developer if we could cut 3, 4, 6 months off of a development process that is worth cash, because you're not paying cost to carry on the land and et cetera. So, but then it came down to, but is that something that this program has any control over? That's on building a permit, and it's not something that this code really can influence in a way that would be practical. And I think, Rogerio can probably speak to this, that's cash in the bank. If you can speed that process up and say, you can move to the top of the line every time you come to the desk because you're doing these wonderful things with your project. If we could figure out a way to make that happen at the staff level, I think it could be a wonderful thing. We didn't get there. So, this maybe requires a little more conversation. But I think that high performance facades save energy because they're multi-layered and they have, additional rainwater runoff and insulation and all kinds of things that reduce the energy required. There's a lot of choices here, and the question is, what do we want to give up for it? And that's really what it came down to. And how do we take any of these and make them mandatory? If you're doing a building of X size, you have to do thermal chimneys, and if you're doing Y size, you have to do high performance facades, and if you're doing Z size, you need to do, and maybe we make it project specific in terms of the size and the nature of the project, that there's certain incentives that it's not even incentive, it's a requirement. If you're doing a project of this size, it has to have thermal chimneys. If you're doing a project of this size, it has to have high-performance facades or something. I mean,
Well,
it's complicated.
It's super interesting. I think the mandatory part is tricky, but the incentive part is great. I think that's a great idea, because then you can give them a list of options that we favor, and you have an incentive going. It sounds like this hasn't been thoroughly or vetted enough yet.
I think we're very, very close, but I think I hate to say it, but we maybe need one more meeting.
I want to throw out for the sake of discussion that embedded in the third-party green building rating system incentive or requirement, really, in order to meet that, a project would need to incorporate the passive design strategies that you're talking about. So it's here, it's just not explicit.
Where?
So the option 3, the requirement, the option for a project to achieve LEED Platinum or Living Building Challenge certification. In order to achieve those things, a project really needs to be designed to do many things, including all of the passive strategies that you've been discussing. So that idea is embedded in the policy. It's just not called out as a specific requirement. I would suggest it would be extraordinarily challenging to develop a program that says a certain building has to employ a certain strategy. It's just not going to work on every site and every project.
Complicated, and there's too many moving parts.
Not how design works.
Yeah.
and it's very restrictive, I would imagine, for the architect, too, to have to do a lot of the things.
So then are the incentives still too vague?
It's not that they're vague. I think that so for example, the high energy efficient building, 50% over Title 24. As a state, we're about to go to ZNE, zero net energy. So why aren't we saying, okay, go to ZNE early? That to me would be something that maybe is then worth an additional FAR or 10% reduction in parking or something. To me, a lot of this is about the balance in terms of what we're getting back to being a progressive city. And you know, Robin, you started off the meeting that the directive from council was for us to continue to be best in class. And so I want us to try for that.
Sure, and can I make a clarification? So the high achieving measure that talks about highly energy efficient buildings references high-rise residential, so residential over 4 stories, and non-residential, which actually won't be required to be zero net energy with the turn of this code cycle. Those projects are harder to do zero net energy at this time. The technology is not there. So for those projects, if they were to be able to perform 50% more than code, especially the 2019 code, which is even more strict than the 2016 code, that's a significant achievement. And so that's why we have that in there. We try to listen to the working group and push the envelope with some of those high achieving measures. So LEED Platinum, gray water, which has its own complications, and then highly energy efficient buildings. So I just wanted to clarify that.
I'm never quite sure how the protocol works here, but there's in this best in class, the other sort of perspective on best in class is to provide performance standards and flexibility to the design teams. And so that's why these rating systems are referenced to say, we want you to achieve at the highest level of LEED Platinum, but there's all kinds of options for how you would get there. Many of the items you mentioned, you would have to do to get enough points to be LEED Platinum. Living Building Challenge, you have to be net positive energy, net zero water. You can't use any materials that have any toxicity in them. So, it's an incredibly robust standards that we're moving forward with. What's good about them is the designers can choose which pathway. And rather than prescribing a facade or a specific strategy, thermal chimneys are great if you have a building that you can design them correctly, so they really do suck the air out through displacement. But if they're not done well, then it's sort of a sad kind of green totem that's stuck in your project. The other thing I wanted to say is to just frame all of this, like we're trying to sort of squeeze citywide sustainability out of buildings. And the next thing kind of on the docket is the climate action plan. which lets us look outside of the building and look at, other things that are going on in the city, public rights of way, other places to put trees. So, we may be trying to, squeeze, blood from a stone with the buildings when we really need to be sort of expanding our vantage point, which is where a lot of cities are going in this pursuit of sustainability.
Well, and we discussed this a lot in the working group. I mean, we as a city have the most infrastructure. The residences, the buildings that are privately owned are what percentage of what the city effectively owns in terms of all the alleyways and the roadways and the sidewalks and all of that infrastructure that we as a city have control over. We have some real opportunities in our alleys. In fact, someone was just telling me Burbank has managed to put those reflective white pavings on their alleyways in downtown Burbank, which is highly reflective. It combats heat island effect, and it's something that certainly we should be looking at for our own alleyways. But that's not part of this, So those are all things that we touched on, but we kept trying to narrow it back to the building, okay? But the building reflects the lot, so it's about what's going to come to this body when it comes to approving another project. Are we going to rip out 30 trees and then pave it lot line to lot line in a garage and not have any ability to plant more trees again? And so that's where I was hoping that this code could go, at least in the short term, because it's going to be a long time before we revisit this again. And we have the opportunity now to say, no, we really feel it's important that we have actual green space left when we tear down that single-family home and rip out every last living green thing from the yard, that we replace it with canopy trees that were torn out. And how do we do that? And there was some conversation about this would be something that would be delegated to the new urban design studio, which, do we have anyone there yet? No new hire? Okay, no. So that's still however long off in terms of the hire, much less getting some of this stuff addressed. So should it be addressed as part of this code so that we can say, thank you, but your garage cannot go lot line to lot line. We need the ability to have our water run down into the aquifer and not down the storm drains. Do we want to do that?
Commissioner Caballero, do you want to comment?
I'm going to ask another question then. So are we prepared to move this forward at all? It sounds to me like we need another conversation about this and really kind of ferret out some of these specific issues and ideas.
In as much as we're talking about, here's our big change to the green building plan, and this is what we're going to do, and we're not going to touch it again for another however many years, I personally think we could do a little better. But I will leave it to my colleagues.
Well, I want to make sure we hear from everybody. So and I want to give you your due, Commissioner Bringarner, but I want to make sure everyone else has an opportunity to comment about what's in front of us right now before we kind of start talking about how we might want to move this. So, Commissioner Caballero, do you want to?
No, I was just going to bring up another example of something that we could explore, like the 5-foot setback in the rear yard is interesting, but part of that possibility is a real study of what that development would look like in the end and what kind of incentive we would have to give to offset the cost of that 5 feet lost in the parking structure and in the building. I'm worried that in deferring this decision, it might take another 6 months, but I wasn't on that committee. So do you feel like it would not take that much, that we could actually button up some of these loose ends and come to something very tangible quickly?
If we had to do a study on something like that, I'm sure that would take some considerable amount of time. Whether or not we could come up with tenable solutions in another meeting, I don't know. It's complicated. And Walker is right in the extent that if you use LEED or whatever, then you're going to have to do a lot of these things in order to achieve it. However, this is optional. That this does not include any requirements for development. So this LED thing or LEED thing is optional. unless you want to do a development agreement. But under these alternatives, okay, that's optional. That's not setting any minimum standards for new development regarding some of this stuff. And I don't have the answers to that because it is complicated, but there is quite a bit of a laundry list of things that do we consider, you know, maybe there's 13 things and you have to pick one of them as a mandatory thing that you're going to do. I don't know.
So if I can jump in for just a moment. Sorry. If there's consensus on the commission to explore additional issues such as, not allowing a garage to go lot line to lot line, one option that the commission has is to tell us those things and include that in your recommendation, and we can take that to the council as part of the discussion, so that the bulk of this can move forward and we can continue to address those issues.
Yes. Commissioner Bass? Sorry, Commissioner Caballero, were you finished? Commissioner Bass?
Yeah, I don't want to rehash. We've had a great conversation as we did at the Long Range Subcommittee. One of the issues I raised at Long Range was my concern that we add incentive on incentive on incentive. And, we recently approved a project that the zone is 35 feet, but it was 56 something feet. And a comment online, and I know we shouldn't read comments on articles online usually, but was how much this commission disregarded our own city ordinance. And even though it was very clear that it was a mixed-use development, so they got an extra floor, and then there was the additional feet that they got for having low-income units on the site and all of that. They got to where they were supposed to be. It wasn't like we really made an exception. We just followed the code and the state law as it's written. I think that a lot of residents are oftentimes confused when we just keep adding incentive on incentive on incentive, and so they read the code and they don't understand why they can do so much more than what it actually says. And so I'm always concerned about adding even more. So I raise that concern. That being said, as I look at the eligible incentives, I've got to disagree with Commissioner Hoopengarner in that as I look at these things, I believe in a green building ordinance, reducing parking is a green measure within itself. I believe that in a time when we need more housing, increasing a residential unit isn't giving something away as much as it's actually gaining something for the city as well. So I believe that those incentives are actually beneficial to the city if they go along with these other, not just on their own. We shouldn't just give every project those things, but if they are also doing these very high achieving efforts, I believe that the incentives are appropriate here and are not adding yet another floor, which is probably the thing we hear the most about. So I would be comfortable adding the incentives back in, which goes completely contrary to what I said in the Long Range Planning Committee. So thank you for listening to me and allowing me to change my mind. I had a concern about the ground level vegetative space area as well, because my understanding was the same as Commissioner Hoopengarner's, that we said it was going to be outside of the setback. Again, I've changed my mind a little bit. I don't think that that it would be appropriate to allow the entire setback to be included in this. So I'm wondering if there's a way we could say, 50% of it can be in the setback or some random number, and I don't know what number that is and how we get there and how we justify it, but I like the idea of asking for more than what they would have been giving otherwise, and I know that what they'd be giving is nothing built underneath it, but I think adding to that a little bit it is where I was going with that in my thought process. And the only thing that gives me heartache from supporting staff's recommendation or the alternative staff recommendation would be that how to enforce after the 24 months. I just, I have a really hard time with seeing developers agree to these conditions and then just not follow through on them. And it happens a lot, and so we need to have something. I mean, it's the certificate of occupancy. We can't just revoke the certificate of occupancy and kick everyone out. I mean, that's not a reasonable solution, although that would sure get their attention. it would be the wrong thing to do. But we need something, and I don't know what that is, but we need something.
Maybe we could put, excuse me for interrupting you, maybe we could put something in there. The idea of the bond, I think, is a good one, but I think it should be made part of this, that they have to place a bond when they're waiting for their certificate, whatever it is that they're getting from the third-party agency, and that if they fail to comply within that period of time, they forfeit the bond, and the city gets it.
Yeah, I was just thinking while everyone was commenting that we could probably craft some language that this option is only available provided that a performance bond or some other similar security is provided to ensure compliance to the satisfaction of the director. Something like that, that this is only available if we have a compliance mechanism.
That would resolve.
I would like to have that as part of it going
That would
forward.
resolve the heartache I have too. That's all I have to say.
Thank you. Commissioner Altschul?
I think there's perhaps some time constraints here where we have to come to a conclusion and get our sustainability requirements and desires on the books before the state's desire to create enormous amounts of housing, whether it be affordable or luxury, or rentable or so expensive you can't rent it. We need to do this quickly so that we're not frozen out of the ability to do it, and I think that's fast approaching. So let's get something done. I think it's better to have the pie, the omelet, 3/4 or 7/8 baked than look for perfection. In today's climate, with the state legislature and governor the way they're thinking.
Thank you. Okay. So I have a few comments, and I just want to kind of synthesize, I think, what I've heard thus far. It sounds like we have kind of a variety of perspectives, and there's some consensus. I think, first of all, I want to commend staff because as someone who, in my own job, my current role, I have to work across many departments and take into account the opinions and workloads and requests of a number of different stakeholders. I recognize that things like this are just innately complicated, and it's not easy to kind of make everyone happy, right? So I want to thank you for all of the work that's gone into this, and I also recognize that we're up against a deadline. That being said, I also don't want to use a deadline as a reason to not put forth the best possible policy that we can. You know, thinking about the kind of unique nature of West Hollywood, we are geographically and topographically pretty unique. There aren't a lot of other cities that are built into a hill in the way that we are. There aren't a lot of other cities that have the small size that we do, and there aren't a lot of other cities that are as skinny as we are, like as long and narrow. And some of the feedback that I received about what we have in front of us here tonight was that maybe we're not doing all that we can do to leverage that to our advantage insofar as kind of unique approaches to what we could do above and beyond Calgreen within the context of our community. I'm not saying that I have all of the answers to that, but net, I am inclined to move this forward without the incentives. And I want to call attention to these incentives because we talked a lot about incentives at long range. I have not been privy to the kind of the working group, so I will defer to those who have been on it to speak to that. But in reviewing, some of the feedback that we received at long range, there are a few concerns I have about these incentives, and it's not that I don't think that I just don't think that many people are going to use them. The eligible incentive, which is A, we want to incent people to build projects that go beyond the minimum standard. And I think one of the things that surfaced at long-range planning, we had a number of people from the community there or from the development community there who build projects large and small. And, you know, they can get I believe they could get this parking, like they could get these from other places. I don't know that I think there's a lot of incentive for them to do these things when they could get it somewhere else. I also feel like there's a general sentiment from council that an increase in FAR is not the direction that they'd want to go. I will leave that to them to decide. And in terms of C, I feel like, you know, doing really high achieving green building projects is also really, really expensive and probably cost prohibitive for the majority of smaller projects that are going to come before us. You'd have to kind of be, you know, for the developer, and I'm not even playing devil's advocate here, but thinking about it from a developer's perspective, you're not going to spend so much money that it becomes prohibitive to you or something that you're going to put a bunch of money into and not be able to reap the benefits of from a profit standpoint. That's, I mean, I hate to say it, but we live in a capitalist economy. That's just kind of the way things work. So, you know, one of the things that we surfaced, and I know this was shot down, and I understand the reasons why, but was, you know, an expedited plan check process. I mean, I think that pretty much every development kind of representative in the room had noted that that was something that, you know, time is money. And, you know, the way that it's set up in the city right now and some of the issues we've been having with hiring people, you know, on staff, that we've had to kind of farm it out, that's been an issue. But I think I'm inclined to move this forward to council, but leaving these incentives as an alternative. I wouldn't want to move the alternative forward as the recommendation. That's where I netted out with this. I mean, I think Commissioner Hoopengarner has surfaced a lot of fair and, you know, salient points, but I also think that this could take so many different forms, and there's like done things that are finished and things that are perfect. Like, we kind of need to get it to a place, hopefully that's some happy medium between those two things. But that's where I kind of stand on this at this time. It's not that I don't think that the incentives are something that we could put on a piece of paper and say, you could do this. I just don't know that I think that they're going to get used in lieu of other incentives that are available to developers for other things like affordable housing or density bonus, et cetera, et cetera. I just don't know that I think they're going to get used that much. And then again, thinking about, you know, sure, there are big controversial projects that come before us, but a lot of the stuff that we look at is on the smaller side. We're talking like 20 to 30 units, maybe 30 to 40 units. So, and again, I'm ballparking that, but, you know, they're not these like massive Robertson Lane level developments. So, that's where I stand on this at the moment. And I want to make sure that we're building consensus here, that we can move something forward tonight. I hope that we can all get behind and that we feel good, but I do get, you know, I sense that this is going to go to council. We want to move it forward for additional discussion, and that we can, you know, make a recommendation tonight that we feel good about, and that we feel there's obviously going to be additional comment and conversation about this at council. So,
to be clear, I just wanted, you are in favor of the alternative that we received this morning or not?
No,
Okay.
I'm in favor of moving forward staff's recommendation without the alternatives, or moving it forward to council with the alternative, with this other alternative as a potential, but not as the recommendation, if that makes sense, for further discussion. I personally don't, based on the conversations and the feedback that we had at long range, and that we had here, I'm just not inclined. I just don't think they're that helpful. So that's where
I want to thank you, all of you that spoke to that, because I think I'm changing my mind. So I appreciate that, because the more I hear, the more I understand about what that might be. So I think I'm also prepared to move the proposal forward with the option, if there's council wants to look at the alternative, they can do it, but I would recommend go along with the rest of
The original recommendation.
the original recommendation. And I thank you all for leading that discussion.
And I too think that I'm happy that we were looking additionally outside of what staff's recommendations are, and that's why I thought it was good. and provided more incentives in order to actually, I think, look at moving the needle forward. I'm okay with staff's recommendations. I don't find anything egregiously wrong with them, and I agree with the general consensus that has been made here. I wouldn't oppose moving it forward with the option for the alternative for them to consider personally, because I think we should present them that option, because I think council would like to look at 2020 and beyond versus just what I think staff has laid out. So giving them that option would be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I'm okay with moving the alternative forward as an alternative, but I want the feedback that you've heard here tonight to be baked into staff report for council to review, because I do think that it merits conversation. We want there to be incentives people are actually going to use. And again, I'm not in a place where I think that these are going to get used, although, again, as with my feelings about public art, and I don't mean this in West Hollywood, I mean everywhere, it is very difficult to make things that everybody likes. So
I have a quick question for staff.
Sure.
Because within these incentives, do you feel, being the experts in this area, when projects would come to you, that these incentives would be used? I wanted to go ask that question based on, well, we don't know if they would be used very much. Do you see within the ways in which a trend in the field, or how when people come to you all and look at the gamut of issues, would these incentives be used and utilized, or is it kind of a moot point to go along with what Chair Jones was saying, that we just don't really know how much they'd be used?
I'm pretty confident that the additional residential unit is something that would be used. What's interesting is it's for just the smaller projects, which is an area where we see a lot of potential. We didn't get a chance to talk about it much, but in some of our earlier conversations, the courtyard housing typology in West Hollywood was brought forward as something unique to the city, designed to work with the climate and with the hillside, and really a typology that holds a lot of promise for many of the strategies that we talked about earlier, narrow floor plates designed for passive ventilation. And so if there's a way to incentivize sort of thorough thinking on sustainability in that small project by virtue of this incentive, I think it holds a lot of promise. I actually think that's the one that would likely be used. The parking, it's unclear. And then I don't really understand the mechanics of commercial development enough to know when that floor area addition would be valuable enough to offset the cost of doing green. But I do know that an additional residential unit would more than offset the cost of getting you to LEED Platinum. So that's the one that I think has sort of some real juice to it.
That was what I was thinking originally, but got talked out of it a little bit. But I do like the idea of moving it forward as an alternative for council to look at.
again, I'm to be clear on my position, and I don't want to be defensive because it sounds like we're all saying a version of the same thing. I'm fine with moving it forward as an alternative. I just want the comments that were made here tonight to be addressed in staff's report to council. That's all.
May I ask a question before we go on to a motion? You had, when I was speaking, Lauren, you had mentioned you were working on some language on enforceability on the 2-year, the 24-month thing. Can I don't think we need to change the resolution as long as staff's heard that and incorporates that. I don't think I'm seeing objection from staff to incorporate something like that in a recommendation going to council.
Right, because that's part of the alternative language.
No, it's...
It's one of the ones they use to get to a, yes. So in the development agreement, it would be in the development agreement. In the specific plan, yes, we can include the language for all options.
I just don't think we need
would
to go down that
use-
road tonight as
When
long
they
as
would
you...
use that third-party verification system.
I think that that should be a recommendation from commission, that there be language put into their specific.
I just wanted to add, we also are taking note of the comments about the soil issue for the additional green space parking trade-off, and would also suggest some additional language there that perhaps adding, so it says such vegetative space may not be located above an underground structure. I might suggest we add something to the effect of shall be designed to enable water percolation and shall include the tree and everything else that it says.
in perpetuity.
Satisfying for you, Adam?
No future tunnels, no, I don't.
Well, it looks like we have a motion on the floor right now. Commissioner Hooper Garner, would you like to state your motion?
Yes, I would like to move that the original staff recommendation be moved forward with the condition that the language be amended to address what we've all expressed about the bond.
Yes.
Okay? And that if staff chooses to bring forward the alternatives as well, that also include the language about the bond. Okay? But that my motion is very clear that the recommendation is about the original staff report, and that anything that's brought to council would reflect, if this were voted and approved, that that's what this vote was, that the alternative was not our vote. Okay? And yes, the permeability, I think it's important to, and I think it was Adam's comment maybe, that speaking about the intent, that it's very clear in the code about the intent. And I don't know if it's how it's to be addressed, but the fact that how do you say it? Back to paving paradise, that post facto someone can't come in and make it a patio. And I don't know how that would be called out legally. That space is, that's how this space was approved, and that's the condition of its approval, and you can't come back and make it a patio or whatever. And I don't know how you would do that.
I just have a question on the motion, Madam Chair. Could you restate the ways in which you phrased the alternative bringing forward to council? You said if staff sees it fit to include the alternative to the council moving forward. Wouldn't that rely saying, like, if you choose to put it in your final report to council, I would like to make sure that council gets the alternative. And I think it was this phrase,
Right.
weird.
I think what Commissioner Hoopengarner is saying, if I may, is that she would like to move staff's original recommendation, as it's stated in the original staff report, as it was in advance of us receiving this today, that the alternative can be presented to council, but that the alternative is not what we are recommending to council. Is that correct, Commissioner Hoopengarner?
Great.
It's the same way it's in your original staff report. If you want to talk about this
Yes,
alternative, here's the language.
So we have the motion on the floor. Does staff or city attorney have any questions about language? Are you good? Okay, we'll call the question. Don, it still hasn't gone through.
And the motion passes unanimously. This is a recommendation to City Council. There will be no appeal process.
Thank you. Moving right along, item 11 is new business. There is none. Item 12, unfinished business. There is none. Item 13 is excluded consent calendar. There is none. Item 14 is items from staff. Planning manager's update.
Nothing tonight, thank you.
Nothing. Thank you, Bianca. Item 15 is public comment. David, do we have any public speakers?
We have no public speakers.
Great, thank you. Item 16 is items from commissioners.
I would just like to let everyone know I will not be at the next meeting. I am finally graduating with my doctorate. So I will be busy doing family stuff and managing 20 Ericssons. So wish me luck.
We wish you all the best and look forward to our
Congratulations.
second meeting in June where we can refer to you as Dr. John Erickson.
I expect new business cards.
Excellent. Thank you. Anyone else? No? All right. Well, with that, we will adjourn this meeting. We will adjourn to a regularly scheduled meeting on Thursday, May 16th at 6:30 right here at Council Chambers. That's all for this evening, folks. Thank you for coming out.